Daniel did not speak. He recoiled from Amara's touch as if her skin were burning him, dropping her hands so abruptly she stumbled forward. Before she could find her balance, he scrambled backward, knocking into the priest's stand. The microphone caught the ragged, wet sound of his hyperventilating breath, amplifying his panic through the silent church. "I can't," Daniel stammered, his eyes bulging. "I can't do this. Not while he is watching." Gasps rippled through the pews. Amara stood frozen at the altar, her bouquet trembling in her grip as the man she loved looked at her not with adoration, but with absolute, paralyzing terror. Phones slowly rose. Whispers spread like smoke. In the front row, a figure sat motionless in the chaos. A Korean man, broad-shouldered and lethal. The collar of his black suit was open just enough to reveal the dark ink of a spiderweb creeping up his neck. His cold eyes stayed locked on the groom, calm and focused, as if he commanded this breakdown with a single look. Daniel took one last look at the tattooed man and bolted. He shoved past the groomsman and sprinted down the aisle. Amara picked up her skirts and ran after him, tears blurring her vision. She was halfway down the aisle when a large, heavy figure stepped into her path. "Don't," the man in the black suit said, his voice a low rumble. "Don't chase a coward." Amara tried to step around him, but he didn't move an inch. "Let me through," she gasped, her voice breaking on the words. "He's leaving. I have to stop him." "No, you don't," Kong Min-jae said, and there was a dark certainty in his tone that cut to the panic threatening to drown her. "You don't need to chase a man who runs from his own shadow. You need to let him run." "Who are you?" Amara demanded, her chest heaving with hysteria. "Why are you doing this?" The man did not answer her question. Instead, he smoothed the cuffs of his jacket, revealing the tattoos on his knuckles, and turned to face the stunned congregation. The entire church seemed to hold its breath, waiting to see if this was real or some collective hallucination. The silence was so heavy it felt suffocating, broken only by the faint, receding sound of Daniel's footsteps on the pavement outside. Kong Min-jae did not look back at the fleeing groom. He simply walked past Amara, moving with a fluid grace that made the guests shift in their seats without even realizing they were doing it. He climbed the marble steps to the altar. The priest, who had been standing frozen in shock this entire time, took a stumbling step backward, clutching his Bible to his chest as if it were a shield. Min-jae stood in the exact spot where Daniel had been standing just minutes before, a dark, imposing silhouette against the white flowers and holy symbols. He turned to look at Amara, his expression unreadable, his eyes dark and empty of the fear that had consumed her fiancé. "Come here," he said quietly. It wasn't a request. It was a command wrapped in velvet. Amara stared at him, her mind completely blank, unable to process the insanity of the moment. Her legs moved on their own, trembling beneath the layers of silk and tulle, until she stood beside him. Up close, the danger radiating from him was palpable. The spiderweb tattoo on his neck disappeared into the collar of his shirt, but she could see others, strange symbols and jagged lines, inking the skin of his hands. Min-jae turned his gaze to the priest. "You have a ceremony to perform," he said. His tone was polite, but it left absolutely no room for argument. I can't," the priest stammered, his face pale and sweating. "The groom has left. This is highly irregular. I don't even know who you are." Min-jae didn't blink. He reached into his jacket pocket, but instead of a weapon, he pulled out a thick, cream-colored envelope. He placed it gently on the lectern. "Everything is legal. Everything is in order," Min-jae said, his voice carrying through the church with a terrifying weight. "Read the vows." The priest looked at the envelope, then at the terrified faces of the guests, and finally at Amara. He swallowed hard, his hands shaking so badly the pages of his book rustled loudly in the quiet room. He began to speak, rushing through the traditional words like he wanted to get this over with as quickly as possible to escape the predator standing just feet away. Amara barely heard him. She was too focused on the stranger beside her. He stood between her and the congregation like a wall, shielding her from their pity and their judgment, yet trapping her in his shadow. "Do you, Kong Min-jae, take this woman to be your lawfully wedded wife?" the priest asked, his voice cracking. "I do," Min-jae said. There was no hesitation, no doubt, just a calm, terrifying certainty. The priest turned to Amara. "Do you, Amara, take this man?" She looked up at Min-jae. She thought of Daniel running away. She thought of the humiliation waiting for her if she walked back down that aisle alone. She looked at the lethal strength in Min-jae's eyes, a promise of protection that came with a price she couldn't yet name. "I do," she whispered. "Then I pronounce you husband and wife," the priest said quickly. Min-jae didn't smile. He turned to her, his dark eyes locking onto hers. And for the first time, Amara felt the true weight of the devil she had just let into her life. The heavy doors of the church slammed shut behind them, severing the connection to the world Amara had known just an hour ago. Outside, the air was thick with humidity, but the interior of the sleek, black SUV waiting at the curb was cool and sterile. Min-jae didn't offer a hand to help her in. He simply held the door open, his expression impassive, waiting. Amara gathered her voluminous skirts, the white tulle frothing around her like sea foam, and climbed into the dark leather interior. The scent of expensive cologne and something sharper, gun oil perhaps, or ozone, filled the small space. As the car pulled away from the curb, gliding seamlessly into chaotic city traffic, silence stretched between them. Amara sat rigid, her bouquet still clutched in a death grip, the white roses starting to bruise where her fingers dug into the stems. She stole a glance at the man beside her. Min-jae rested his hand on his knee, the movement drawing her eye. The contrast was jarring. Her dress was a cloud of purity and softness, designed for a fairy tale that had just been incinerated. His hand was a map of violence. Bold, black ink swirled across his knuckles and disappeared under his cuff. Dragons, geometric patterns, symbols she couldn't decipher. The ink seemed to absorb the light, stark against the pristine white of her gown that spilled over onto his seat. "Why?" she whispered, the single word feeling inadequate for the magnitude of the disaster. "Why did you do this?" Min-jae didn't look at her. He watched the city blur past the tinted window. "Because a debt was owed." "A debt?" Amara's brow furrowed. Daniel owed you money?" Min-jae finally turned. His eyes were cold, void of empathy, but filled with a terrifying intelligence. "Money is easy to repay. Your fiancé didn't just borrow money. Amara, he sold his future to ensure his business survived. He traded his life for success, gambling that he could outsmart the house." He leaned closer, and Amara shrank back, pressing herself against the door. When the time came to collect, he didn't have the capital. Min-jae continued, his voice low and smooth. "He begged. He pleaded. He offered me everything he had." "So you took me instead?" Horror dawned on her, cold and sharp. "I'm not property. You can't just take me as payment." "He offered you," Min-jae corrected, his eyes narrowing slightly. "He told me that his bride was the only thing of value he had left. He thought I would take you and break you to punish him." Amara felt the blood drain from her face. Daniel, the man she had loved since university, the man who had held her when her father died. He had offered her up to a monster to save his own skin. "But I am not a savage," Min-jae said, leaning back, the distance returning. He looked at his tattooed hand, flexing the fingers as if testing their strength. "I do not break innocent things for sport. However, a contract is a contract." He forfeited his collateral. "That is you." "Collateral?" Amara repeated, the word tasting like ash. "So, I am a prisoner." "You are a wife," Min-jae stated simply. "My wife. And where we are going, that title carries more weight than any debt." The car turned, ascending a private ramp toward a glass tower that pierced the skyline. Amara looked down at her dress, the silk now feeling like a shroud. She was no longer a bride. She was currency, and she had just been deposited into the vault of a man who terrified her more than death itself. The penthouse was a fortress of glass and steel, floating so high above the city that the cars below were nothing more than streams of red and white light. It was silent, sterile, and terrifyingly beautiful. For 3 days, Amara had wandered the halls like a ghost, her bare feet making no sound on the polished marble floors. She was surrounded by guards who refused to meet her eyes and servants who moved like shadows, yet she had never felt more alone. She rounded the corner toward the study, intending to ask again when she could speak to her mother. She froze before she reached the open double doors. Min Jae was inside. He had discarded his suit jacket, his white dress shirt unbuttoned at the collar, sleeves rolled up to his elbows. The ink on his forearm seemed to writhe as he moved, emphasizing the corded muscle beneath. He was not alone. A man in a dark suit was kneeling on the floor, literally kneeling, his forehead pressed against the hardwood in a deep bow of submission. Min Jae stood over him, holding a phone to his ear, speaking in rapid, clipped Korean. His voice was a low rumble, devoid of anger but heavy with a lethal authority that made the air in the hallway feel thin. He said something sharp to the man on the floor, who flinched as if he had been struck. Min Jae hung up the phone and looked down, his expression one of utter boredom. He made a shooing motion with his hand, like swatting away a fly. The man scrambled backward on his hands and knees, bowing repeatedly, before rushing out of the room, sweat slicking his pale face. Amara pressed herself against the wall, her heart hammering against her ribs. This was the monster, the man who owned debts and lives, the man who had taken her as payment. "You can come out, Amara." His voice drifted from the room, calm and knowing. She stiffened, then slowly stepped into the doorway. Min Jae was leaning against his desk, watching her. The cold brutality was gone from his face, replaced by a neutral mask. "Dinner is served," he said, pushing off the desk. "Come." He walked past her without waiting, and she had no choice but to follow. She expected the dining room to be as cold as the rest of the house, perhaps serving raw fish or French cuisine that looked too pretty to eat. But as they approached the table, a scent hit her that stopped her dead in her tracks. It was the smell of home. The rich, smoky aroma of roasted tomatoes, Scotch bonnet peppers, thyme, and frying plantains filled the air. Amara stared at the table. Sitting on a porcelain plate, completely out of place in this high-tech glass tower, was a steaming serving of jollof rice and dodo. She looked up at him, bewildered. Min Jae took his seat at the head of the table, picking up his chopsticks. "My chef had to source the specific peppers from a market across town," he said, as if discussing a business transaction. "He assured me the spice level is authentic. You had to make Nigerian food?" Amara asked, her voice small. "You have not eaten properly since the wedding," Min Jae replied, not looking at her. He gestured to her plate. "I do not starve what is mine. Sit. Eat." Amara sat slowly. She took a bite, the familiar heat exploding on her tongue, bringing tears to her eyes. It tasted like her mother's kitchen. It tasted like the life she had lost. She looked at Min Jae, who was eating his own meal in silence. He had just brought a man to his knees with a few words, yet he had gone to the trouble of finding her comfort in a bowl of rice. She didn't know which version of him terrified her more, the ruthless kingpin or the husband who noticed she was hungry. The vibration of the phone against the nightstand was a jarring intrusion in the silent, hermetically sealed world of the penthouse. Amara stared at the screen, her heart skipping a beat. It was a block number. For a moment, she considered letting it ring. Min Jae was down the hall, likely handling business that involved kneeling men and hushed orders. If he heard her talking to the outside world, what would he do? But the persistent buzzing clawed at her, a lifeline to a life that felt like it had existed years ago, not just days. She swiped answer and pressed the phone to her ear, her hand trembling. "Hello? Amara?" The voice was a ragged whisper, broken by heavy breathing. "Oh, God! Amara, you're alive!" "Daniel." A cold shock doused the simmering heat of the anger she had been nursing. She gripped the phone tighter, her knuckles turning white. "Daniel, listen to me. We don't have much time." Daniel rushed on, his words tumbling over each other in a frantic stream. "You have to get out of there. You have to find a way to leave. He's going to kill you. Amara. He's going to kill you just to hurt me." "Kill me?" Amara stood up, her legs feeling weak. "You left me there, Daniel. You left me at the altar in front of everyone I know. And now you called to tell me I'm going to die. I didn't have a choice." Daniel's voice cracked, rising into a sob. "You don't understand who he is. You saw the tattoos. Amara, that isn't art. That's a death sentence. I borrowed money, too much money, to expand the logistics firm. I thought I could pay it back, but the interest, it doubled every week. When I missed the last payment, he sent me a box. Amara felt the blood drain from her face. A box. With a finger inside, Daniel whispered, the terror palpable even through the digital connection. He told me if I didn't pay by the wedding, he would take everything I loved. I thought he meant he would kill you at the church. That's why I ran. I thought if I wasn't there, he wouldn't do it. Amara sank on the edge of the bed. The image of Minjae, the man who had quietly ordered her favorite meal just hours ago, who had shielded her from the paparazzi with his own body, clashed violently with the monster Daniel was describing. He didn't kill me, Daniel, Amara said, her voice shaking. He married me. That's worse, Daniel hissed. Don't you see? It's a game to him. He's keeping you as a trophy, a pet. When he gets bored, or when he decides I haven't suffered enough, he'll dispose of you. You are living with a monster, Amara, a demon in a suit. He fed me, Amara whispered, more to herself than to him. He protected me. He's grooming you. Daniel screamed, losing control. Please, baby, I'm trying to get the money. I'm selling everything. Just don't let him touch you. Don't look him in the eye. I'm coming for you. I promise I'm coming. The line went dead before she could respond. Amara lowered the phone, her breath coming in shallow gasps. She looked around the luxurious room, at the silk sheets and the panoramic view of the city. Suddenly, the walls didn't feel like a sanctuary. They felt like the glass walls of a viper's terrarium. She thought of the jollof rice. She thought of the way Minjae had looked at the priest, calm and terrifying. Was the kindness just another form of cruelty? Was she eating the food of a man who had mailed her fiancé a severed finger? Amara walked to the door and locked it. It was a futile gesture in a house Minjae owned, but it was the only control she had left. She curled up on the bed, pulling her knees to her chest, trapped between the memory of a coward who claimed to love her and the reality of a monster who claimed to own her. The storm outside mirrored the chaos in Amara's mind. Rain lashed against the floor-to-ceiling windows of the penthouse, turning the city lights into smeared, weeping streaks of neon. It was past 2 a.m, but sleep was impossible. Daniel's terrified whisper still echoed in her ears. A box with a finger inside. A heavy thud from the entryway shattered the silence. Amara froze, clutching her silk robe tighter. She waited for the rhythmic click of guards' heels, but the hallway remained quiet. Then came a low, pained grunt. She moved toward the sound, her bare feet silent on the cold marble. In the foyer, Kong Minjae was leaning against the wall, his forehead resting against the plaster. His impeccable posture was gone. His breathing was ragged, wet. Minjae, she whispered. He whipped his head around, his eyes wild for a fraction of a second before the mask slammed back into place. Go back to bed, Amara. But she saw it, a dark, spreading stain on the side of his white dress shirt. The crisp fabric was ruined, soaked in crimson. You're bleeding, she said, the fear of him momentarily eclipsed by the instinct to help. She stepped closer. Let me help you. It is nothing, a scratch. He tried to push off the wall, but his knees buckled. Amara caught him, her small frame straining against his dead weight. He hissed a curse in Korean, the sound sharp and guttural, but he didn't shove her away. Together, they made it to the expansive bathroom. She sat him on the edge of the marble tub and fumbled for the first aid kit she had seen earlier. When she turned back, Minjae was trying to unbutton his shirt, his fingers slick with blood and clumsy. Stop, she commanded, batting his hands away. Let me. He went still, watching her with heavy-lidded, intense eyes as she undid the buttons. She peeled the ruined fabric away, and her breath hitched. She had seen the ink on his neck and hands, but she wasn't prepared for the canvas beneath. His torso was a masterpiece of violence. A roaring tiger clawed its way across his chest, its eyes burning with malice. Waves of black water crashed over his ribs in jagged geometric patterns, protection sigils, perhaps, intertwined with thick, raised scars that disrupted the art. The wound was a long, shallow slice across his ribs, cutting to the tail of the tiger. It was ugly, but not deep enough to be fatal. "Daniel said you were a monster," Amara whispered, dabbing the wound with antiseptic. Min-jae flinched, his muscles rippling under her touch. He said the ink was a death sentence. "Daniel sees only the teeth," Min-jae grunted, his voice tight with pain. "He does not look at the man holding the leash." "What does it mean?" She traced the edge of the scar that ran parallel to the fresh cut. "All of this." "History," he said, looking down at his own skin, as if reading a book. "The tiger is for power. The waves are for the chaos we must survive. The scars—" He looked up at her, his gaze piercing. "The scars are the cost of survival. I earned every line on this body. I paid for my position in blood, so that no one could ever own me." Amara bandaged the wound, her hand steady despite the adrenaline coursing through her. "You own Daniel. I own his debt. There is a difference. And me?" She met his gaze. "Do you own me?" Min-jae reached out, his tattooed hand cupping her cheek. His thumb brushed over her lip, a touch that was shockingly gentle from a hand so capable of destruction. "I could have let you fall, Amara," he said softly. "I could have let you stand at that altar and crumble while the world laughed. It would have been cleaner, easier. Why didn't you?" "Because I know what it feels like to stand alone in a room full of people who are waiting for you to break," he murmured. "I saw your face. You were not terrified of losing him. You were terrified of the shame. I could not watch it." He dropped his hand, the moment of vulnerability snapping shut like a trap. "I do not own you, Amara, but I will not let you be discarded. There is a difference." Amara looked at the fresh white bandage against the dark, swirling ink. She realized then that Daniel had run to save his skin, but Min-jae had bled to keep his word. The monster in the suit was dangerous. Yes, but he was the only one who hadn't left her behind. The charity gala was a sea of black ties and diamonds, held in a ballroom that smelled of champagne and old money. Amara stood at the top of the grand staircase, her hand resting on the crook of Kong Min-jae's arm. Tonight, she was not wearing white. Min-jae had selected a gown of deep, midnight blue velvet that clung to her curves and pulled at her feet, a stark contrast to the innocent bride she had been a week ago. Diamonds dripped from her ears, heavy, cold, and undeniably real. "Breathe," Min-jae murmured, his voice a low vibration against her ear. "They are only sharks, Amara, and you are with the Leviathan." He stepped forward, and they descended. The effect was instantaneous. As soon as Min-jae's silhouette cut through the golden light of the chandeliers, the murmur of conversation died. Heads turned. Glasses were lowered. The crowd parted effortlessly, creating a wide path to the center of the room. It wasn't a polite deference given to celebrity. It was a primal, instinctive retreat of prey sensing a predator. Amara felt a tremor go through her hand, but Min-jae covered it with his own. His grip was warm, solid, and unyielding. Unlike Daniel, who used to sweat through his dress shirts at events like this, nervously checking his phone and laughing too loud at investors' jokes, Min-jae was perfectly still. He didn't seek attention. He commanded it simply by existing. "Smile," he whispered, his lips brushing her temple as he guided her through the throng. "They are waiting for cracks in the armor. Do not give them the satisfaction." Amara forced the corners of her mouth up, tilting her chin. A waiter appeared instantly with champagne, his hand shaking slightly as he offered the flute to Min-jae. Min-jae, a heavy-set man in a tuxedo, approached them, flanked by two younger associates. Amara recognized him. A politician she had seen on the news, known for his aggressive policies and loud speeches. Now, he looked like a schoolboy called to the principal's office. "Mr. Kong," the politician said, dipping his head in a bow that was deeper than necessary. "We didn't expect to see you tonight. And your lovely wife." "Senator," Min-jae acknowledged, his voice smooth as glass shards. He didn't bow back. He didn't even offer his hand. He simply stood there, one hand in his pocket, the other resting possessively on the small of Amara's back. "My wife enjoys the arts. I thought it best to introduce her to the city properly." The senator's eyes flicked to Amara, nervous and assessing. "Of course. A pleasure, Mrs. Kong. If there is anything you need, Anything at all. My office is at your disposal." "She needs nothing from you," Min Jae said softly, his smile not reaching his eyes. "I provide for my own." The senator paled, stammering an apology before retreating into the crowd. Amara watched him go, stunned. She remembered attending a fundraiser with Daniel once, where he had begged a councilman for 5 minutes of his time, practically humiliating himself for a permit approval. Tonight, a senator had bowed to her simply because Min Jae's hand was on her waist. "Dance with me," Min Jae said, guiding her to the floor as the orchestra swelled. He pulled her close, his hand sliding up her back to rest between her shoulder blades, shielding her from a room. As they moved, Amara realized something that terrified her more than the violence she knew he was capable of. She wasn't afraid. For the first time in her life, amidst the sharks and vipers, she felt completely, untouchably safe. The monster wasn't hiding under her bed. He was holding her in his arms, and he was staring down the rest of the world, so she didn't have to. "You're staring," Min Jae murmured, looking down at her. "I'm realized something," Amara whispered, leaning into his touch, no longer acting. "Daniel was afraid of these people, but they are terrified of you." "Good," Min Jae said, his dark eyes burning with a fierce, possessive heat. "Then they will never touch you." The bubble of invincibility followed them out into the cool night air. The heavy oak doors of the venue closed, muffling the music and laughter, leaving only the sound of their footsteps on the pavement. The valet stand was empty, the attendant missing. Min Jae stopped. The hand on the small of her back went from a gentle guide to a rigid clamp. "Min Jae?" Amara started to ask, but he was already moving. "Down," he snarled, shoving her toward the concrete pillar of the portico. The air shattered. Glass exploded where Amara had been standing a split second before. The sharp crack, crack, crack of automatic gunfire ripped through the silence, deafening and relentless. Amara hit the ground, scraping her knees through the velvet gown, her hands covering her head as debris rained down on them. She expected pain. She expected the bite of a bullet. Instead, she felt a heavy weight crash over her. Min Jae was on top of her, curling his massive frame around hers, pressing her into the cold pavement. He was a human shield, his body absorbing the shocks and tremors of the assault. She could feel the impact of something striking the concrete inches from his head, showering them in dust. "Stay down," he roared, his voice unrecognizable, guttural and demonic. He rolled off her, drawing a sleek, black pistol from a holster concealed beneath his jacket. The movement was so fluid it looked practiced, a muscle memory forged in violence. 3 men in ski masks were advancing from a black SUV that had screeched to the curb. They moved with military precision, weapons raised. Min Jae didn't hesitate. He fired twice. 2 distinct cracks. The lead attacker's head snapped back, a mist of red spraying into the lamplight before he crumbled to the ground. Amara screamed, the sound tearing from her throat, but it was drowned out by more gunfire. The second man rushed Min Jae while he was exposed. Min Jae didn't retreat. He stepped into the danger. He caught the man's wrist, twisting it with a sickening crunch that Amara heard over the ringing in her ears. The man shrieked, dropping his weapon. Min Jae slammed the butt of his pistol into the man's temple, once, twice. The sound of metal hitting bone was wet and final. The attacker went limp, sliding down Min Jae's front like a discarded rag doll. The third man hesitated. That was his mistake. Min Jae raised his weapon and ended it with a single shot to the chest. Silence rushed back in, sudden and terrifying. Amara lay on the concrete, trembling so violently her teeth chattered. The air smelled of sulfur and copper. Her beautiful blue dress was ruined, soaked in dark, sticky fluid pooling from the man Min Jae had bludgeoned just feet away from her. Min Jae stood over the bodies, his chest heaving. His suit was torn, his knuckles split and bleeding. He turned to her. His face was splattered with blood that wasn't his. The calm, bored mask he wore at the party was gone. In its place was the face of the Reaper, eyes wide, pupils blown, lips pulled back in a snarl of pure adrenaline. He reached for her, and for the first time since the wedding, Amara flinched. Min Jae froze. He looked at his bloody hand, hovering inches from her face, then at her terrified eyes. The illusion of the safe, powerful husband in the tuxedo had vanished. The monster was out of the cage, and he was standing in a graveyard of his own making. "I told you," he whispered, his voice shaking with the aftershocks of rage. "I told you what I was." The silence in the penthouse was heavier than the gunfire had been. Min Jae stood by the window, his back to her. He had shed his ruined jacket, and his white shirt was stained with the blood of the men who had tried to kill them. He wasn't looking at the city lights tonight. He was staring into the dark reflection of his own violent existence. "Pack your things," he said, his voice rough. He didn't turn around. Amara sat on the edge of the sofa, still shaking. Clutching a glass of water, Mrs. Kong had pressed into her hands. "What?" "The debt is cleared," Min Jae said. He turned then, and his face was a mask of exhausted resignation. "I have transferred the funds to cover Daniel's liabilities. He is free, and so are you." "I don't understand," Amara whispered. "You're sending me away?" "I am saving you," Min Jae snapped, the control cracking for a second. Tonight was a warning. Next time, they will not miss. "I cannot keep you in a war zone, Amara. I am a selfish man, but I am not cruel enough to let you die for me." The elevator chimed. Amara flinched, expecting more gunmen, but the door slid open to reveal a frantic, breathless Daniel. He looked exactly as he had on their wedding day. Pristine. He was wearing a clean beige sweater and slacks, his face unblemished, his hands soft and manicured. He rushed into the room, his eyes scanning Amara for injuries. "Amara..." He fell to his knees beside her, grabbing her hands. "He called me. He told me I could come." "Oh, God, look at you. Did he hurt you?" Amara looked at Daniel. He smelled of expensive fabric softener and fear. His hands were warm and dry. He was safe. He was the life she had planned. Sunday brunches, church services, a quiet, bloodless existence. Then she looked at Min Jae. He had retreated to the shadows of the kitchen, leaning against the counter as if he could barely stand. His knuckles were split and raw. There was a bruise forming on his jaw. He was covered in filth and violence, a ruin of a man who had stood between her and a bullet without blinking. "Come on," Daniel said, tugging at her arm. "The car is downstairs. We can go home. We can forget this ever happened." "Forget?" Amara pulled her hands away. The movement was slow, deliberate. "You want to forget that you sold me? Or do you want to forget that you ran?" Daniel recoiled. "I told you I was scared. I did what I had to do to survive." "So, did he?" Amara said, her voice rising. She stood up, looking down at the man she had once thought she would spend her life with. "You ran to save yourself, Daniel. He bled to save me. That is the difference. He's a killer, Amara." Daniel pointed a trembling finger at Min Jae. "Look at him. He's covered in blood." "Yes," Amara said, her gaze shifting to Min Jae, softening. "He is covered in blood, because he didn't let them touch me." She turned back to Daniel. "You're clean, Daniel. You're perfectly, safely clean. And I don't want you." Daniel opened his mouth, but the look in her eyes stopped him. It wasn't anger, it was indifference. He looked from her to the silent, brooding figure of the Mafia boss, and he realized he had lost something far more valuable than money. Without another word, Daniel stood up. He cast one last terrified glance at Min Jae and fled the penthouse, just as he had fled the church. The elevator doors closed, leaving them alone again. Min Jae stared at her, his dark eyes wide with disbelief. "You should have gone," he rasped. "I cannot promise you safety. Amara, I can only promise you this life." Amara walked across the room until she was standing right in front of him. She reached out, her fingers ghosting over the blood-stained shirt, right over his heart. "I don't want safe," she whispered. "I want you." The wind whipping around the penthouse balcony was cold, but Amara didn't shiver. 1 year ago, she would pull a shawl tight around her shoulders, seeking warmth. Tonight, she stood near the edge of the railing, letting the breeze play with the slit of her crimson silk dress, holding her wine glass with a steady hand. Below, the city of Seoul was a grid of electric fire, a kingdom that breathed and bled, and she was no longer the terrified tourist trapped in its tower. She was part of its skyline. Arms slid around her waist from behind. Heavy, warm, and possessive. Amara didn't flinch. She leaned back, resting her head against the solid wall of Kong Min-jae's chest. The scent of him, gunmetal, expensive cologne, and the faint, sharp tang of cigar smoke, was now the smell of home. "You are thinking too loudly," Min-jae murmured, his lips brushing the sensitive skin below her ear. "It echoes." "I'm thinking about the date," Amara replied, tracing the veins on his hands, which were clasped over her stomach. The tattoos that had once terrified her were now a map she knew by heart. She knew where the tiger's tail ended and where the scars from that night in the alley began. "It's been exactly a year." "A year since I stole a bride," Min-jae corrected, his voice vibrating against her spine. "A year since you saved me," she countered, turning in his arms to face him. Min-jae looked down at her. The harsh lines of his face hadn't softened. He was still the Kekangpa boss who could silence a room with a glance. But when he looked at her, the predator slept. He took in her appearance, the way the bold red dress contrasted against her dark skin, the way she met his gaze without a hint of fear. The trembling girl in the white lace gown was dead. In her place stood a woman forged in the fire of his world. "I gave you a cage," Min-jae said quietly, his thumb stroking her cheekbone. "I dragged you into a war you did not choose. I made you a target. And you gave me the weapons to fight back," Amara said, her voice firm. She thought of the lessons in the shooting range, the night spent strategizing over territory maps, the way she had learned to walk into a room of enemies and not blink. "I am not a victim, Min-jae. Not anymore." Min-jae stared at her for a long moment, a storm of emotion swirling in his dark eyes. Then, slowly, he reached into his pocket. He didn't kneel. Kings did not kneel, and he knew she didn't want him to bow. Instead, he held up a small black velvet box. Inside sat a ring that made the one Daniel had given her look like a toy. It was a massive, uncut black diamond, set in platinum that looked like twisted thorns. "The first time I took you," Min-jae said, his voice rough with intensity, "I claimed you as payment. I forced a vow from your lips to save your pride. There was no choice." He took her hand, his rough fingertips grazing her palm. "But the debt is paid, Amara. The contract is fulfilled. You are free." He held her gaze, stripping himself bare of all defenses. "So I am asking you, without coercion, without threat, will you stay? Will you take this life, with all its blood and its darkness, and rule it with me?" Amara looked at the black diamond, dark, dangerous, and unbreakable. It wasn't a promise of a fairy tale. It was a promise of power. She looked up at the man who had walked through hell to keep her safe, the man who had taught her that she was strong enough to survive the flames. "I don't want to be free," Amara whispered, threaded her fingers through his. "I want to be yours." "Say it," Min-jae commanded, his eyes burning. "Yes," she said, her voice ringing out into the night air. "I will marry you, Min-jae. For real." He slid the ring onto her finger. It fit perfectly. Min-jae pulled her flush against him, burying his hands in her hair, and kissed her,